Australia can and should be at the table, having these discussions about how to build something new and something better out of the destruction that Trump is wreaking.
One for Mum, one for Dad, and one for the country.
And there has never been a more exciting time to be an Australian.
Budgets are about choices, Fran, and you show what you value through the choices you make.
This is coal. Don't be afraid. Don't be scared. The Treasurer knows.
I want an economy that works for people, not the other way around.
We'll just end up being a third-rate economy, a banana republic.
Just follow the money.
Hello and welcome to Follow the Money, the Australia Institute podcast, which explains economics, politics and policy in plain English. I'm Glenn Connley. The Trump administration is trashing what remained of the post-World War II international order.
The United States Armed Forces conducted an extraordinary military operation in the capital of Venezuela. We're going to run the country until such time as we can do a safe, proper, and judicious transition.
We are going to do something on Greenland, whether they like it or not.
And I don't want to be cute, I don't want to be a wise guy, but the Riviera of the Middle East, this could be something that could be so bad. This could be so magnificent.
It's kidnapped the leader of Venezuela, announced it was annexing Greenland for unspecified national security reasons, and threatened several other countries with military strikes. And it's not even February. Meanwhile, on the streets of Minnesota, ICE agents are shooting people dead like some sort of dystopian horror film. So what does this mean for global politics and economics? And how can a middle power like Australia navigate this rapidly changing world? With me today to help answer those questions and more is Greg Jericho, the Australia Institute's chief economist. G'day, Greg.
G'day, Glenn.
And Emma Shortis, Director of International and Security Affairs at the Australia Institute. Hi, Emma.
Hi, Glenn.
Emma, let's start in the US. We've seen an invasion, threats of several more, killings on the streets of Minnesota, including that harrowing case of Alex Pretty, shot in the back 10 times on Saturday. What's going on?
Yeah, it's absolutely awful, Glenn. Horrendous to watch. You shouldn't watch it, I think, if you don't have to. And really, it's a marker of where the Trump administration is taking the United States. Trump was elected on a platform of mass deportations, the biggest deportation program that the United States has ever seen. And in order to do that, he and his administration are enacting a program of violence. And I think, if you look at their language in the lead up and in the aftermath, you can see that they've been encouraging this violence, especially on the part of ICE agents, of federal agents on the streets of Minnesota. It wasn't long ago that the president literally told these people they can do whatever the hell they want.
And then they start spitting in their face. And I said, you tell them, you spit and we hit. And they can hit real hard. Police are standing, and they're told, don't do anything under any search. So and you can see they want to get at it. And they're standing there, and people are spitting in their face, and they're not allowed to do anything. But now they are allowed to do whatever the hell they want.
And the Vice President, J.D. Vance, has said, although he's trying to walk this back now in characteristic fashion, but he said quite clearly that they have absolute immunity. And this is the kind of result that you see. And it's terrifying. It's clearly terrifying and harrowing, particularly for the people on the streets of Minnesota at the moment. But it's not all one way. We're seeing a significant amount of grassroots democratic resistance, and it's clearly having an effect on the administration, as much as it's continuing down its usual path in terms of lying and attempting to escalate violence. It appears that Trump is now starting to walk some of this back. So there are suggestions as we're recording that Bovino, who's the head of ICE, is being taken out of Minneapolis, that some of the presence of agents will be wound down. I think we need to wait and see, but certainly the administration has underestimated the breadth and the depth of democratic resistance to what it's doing.
We are in the midst of a rupture, not a transition. An American hegemony in particular helped provide public goods, open sea lanes, a stable financial system, collective security, and support for frameworks for resolving disputes. We participated in the rituals, and we largely avoided calling out the gaps between rhetoric and reality. This bargain no longer works. Great powers can afford for now to go it alone. They have the market size, the military capacity, and the leverage to dictate terms. Middle powers do not. But when we only negotiate bilaterally with a hegemon, we negotiate from weakness. We accept what's offered. We compete with each other to be the most accommodating. Middle powers must act together because if we're not at the table, we're on the menu.
He also seems to be walking back some of the foreign policy threats. At the World Economic Forum last week, Canadian PM Mark Carney called it a rupture as opposed to a transition in the world order, including that memorable quote, "If you're not at the table, you're on the menu." Do you agree? Is Carney right when he says middle powers like Australia and Canada actually have some agency to bring about some change here?
I think absolutely Carney's right, Glenn. And, part of the reason that Carney's speech hit such a nerve for people was because he actually, as he put it, he named reality. He described really clearly to people what we are seeing with our very own eyes, which is a rupture, which is the Trump administration absolutely and deliberately destroying the international rule of law. But I think what was so refreshing about what Carney said, and the fact that Carney himself said it, was that he was laying out clearly that what the world looks like coming out of this isn't just up to Donald Trump. Like, other people still have a say, they have power, they have agency. And countries like Canada and Australia are particularly well placed to do that, given our economic heft, given our cultural heft, given our existing connections, our ability to build networks. We just have to choose to do that, to rebuild alliances around shared interests and shared values and in a changing world. Now, admittedly, that is not an easy thing to do. And there is a lot at stake, especially when it comes to the Trump administration. But actually having that ambition for something better, I think, especially for countries like Canada and Australia to play a role in building something better, really resonated for a reason. There's a huge appetite for that.
You mentioned our economic heft. Greg, last week the IMF released a report on the global economy, and I saw a headline in the Murdoch press that said it had issued some sort of warning to Anthony Albanese. Did it really warn we're facing some sort of crisis here?
Yeah, look, it's always amazing how any international report seemingly is focused only on Australia, if you read the Australian media. In reality, this report, which was an update to its October economic outlook, mentioned Australia once.
Big warning.
Literally just once, and that was in a paragraph talking about what's happening with inflation around the world. It sort of did a bit of a summary. And it pointed out that inflation in Norway and Australia is remaining a bit higher than would be hoped. And that was it. That was it, basically, the end of the sentence. And this was taken as being the IMF calls out Australia's inflation, and the Financial Review suggested in its editorial that it was also calling out the Albanese government's fiscal, mismanagement. And it really wasn't. It was just basically, Australia barely even registers in these reports, whether it be the OECD or the IMF, unless they do a specific thing on Australia. We're a little blip on the world stage. But one of the things that really, though, came across in the IMF report was this sort of attempt to just sane wash everything that's going on in the world. The headline of the actual report was "Steady Amid Divergent Forces." Now, yeah, do you call Trump a divergent force? I guess that's a nice way of explaining it. But, they released the report the very day after Trump threatened to raise tariffs on basically all European nations to 10% and to 25% by June if he didn't get Greenland. And, in their report, which obviously didn't mention that because it was written before then, it just had that trade tensions have continued to abate, as though, all is good, and then but remain subject to occasional flare-ups. And, it was just, when I read the report, it really struck me as just being indicative of how not just media, but even international organizations of fairly large standing, like the IMF and even governments, go out of their way to make it sound like what Trump's doing is kind of just a little bit abnormal, but not that much, just a bit more than others would do, and, make him sound like he's just a bit more extreme, normal Republican politician. And I think Emma would probably agree that what she's talking about with Carney is that for once there wasn't this sort of let's try and sane wash this thing and actually point out we're having a pretty big rupture in what's going on. And it's not just, oh, we've got this guy who pushes the envelope a little bit. No, he's torn up the envelope, he's swallowed it, and now he's sitting on his gold toilet trying to pass through his system. I mean,
Ew.
And I don't know what I had for lunch that analogy came out, but it's when you go with Trump, you cannot overstate just how bad things have become, and yet we see constantly this temp of, oh no, it's things are steady, things are calm, it's okay, and it's like, no, it's not, and you can't even guarantee that what you said last week or what you wrote last week when the IMF wrote it will hold even on the day that it's published, and it didn't.
You mentioned gold and toilets. Can you explain the relevance of the skyrocketing price of gold to the Trump uncertainty in the global economy?
Yeah, gold is this weird mineral that basically is kind of worthless if you think about it in terms of what it actually does. It is purely has value in that it is essentially fairly rare, and as a result, it's a mineral or a commodity that people buy when basically the world is going to hell because the value of gold is limited to basically how much gold there is. And so when there are times of uncertainty, the price of gold goes up, and it has absolutely skyrocketed over the past year since Trump's inauguration. In fact, gold prices have gone up 75%, so a massive amount. It has gone up faster than any time since the 1979 oil crisis. So basically, Trump's first year in terms of making investors feel uncertain and think the world is all a bit precarious is on a par with, the OPEC nations deciding to put embargoes on oil after an Iran revolution. I mean, this is how huge it is. And it basically is just a sign of the more gold goes up, the less certain people feel. And what's more interesting is when investors feel uncertain, sometimes they will buy US Treasury bonds because they're generally pretty secure, pretty safe. What they're doing at the moment is looking at Trump and going, yeah, I don't feel all that safe about what the US Treasury is doing. Let's just go to gold. And that has just seen prices go mad. Even here in Australia, we're seeing, people line up. They're actually being lines up outside, essentially, the gold dealers. Because one of the things when you buy gold, you actually have to buy it. You can't just sort of buy it and think, oh, someone else will actually hold that gold. No, you have to buy it and you have to store it somewhere. And when it's going for $5,000 an ounce, that's 5,000 US an ounce. If you want to buy, even a kilogram of it, you're talking big money. And if you're someone who's buying a lot of it, you got to store it somewhere. Interestingly, there are reports of suggestions that Germany, which holds a lot of gold and holds a lot of gold in America, are suggesting maybe they should bring that gold home. So there's a lot going on, and it all just comes back to Trump and his insanity.
Emma, Trump has done a lot of threatening militarily, but he's also makes economic threats using America's economic power. The word being thrown around for the way the world is reacting is some countries and groups want to decouple themselves from America in a foreign policy sense and an economic sense. Is Australia one of those, or should Australia be one of those countries?
Well, certainly I think we would argue that, for reasons of risk that Greg was just outlining. And certainly from my read, Glenn, there is much more of an appetite in the Australian community as opposed to the Australian government for thinking through pretty honestly what our relationship with the United States, with this version of the United States, looks like moving into the future. And certainly it's obvious that Canada and Canadians are having that conversation. Going back to what Greg was saying before, Mark Carney gave this speech at the World Economic Forum, and straight away the president is threatening all of Canada with 100% tariffs, which he likely won't follow through on because he doesn't generally follow through on all of his threats. But this is the kind of reactive instability that we're talking about. And insulating yourself against that risk makes a lot of sense. Mark Carney is a banker originally. That's how he thinks. And he is clearly identifying significant risk here. And there's significant risk for Australia as well to consider insulating ourselves against. Greg will know the numbers better than I do, but Australia invests, I think, trillions of dollars in superannuation funds in the United States. What sovereign risk does that expose us to, given the volatility of this president and what he said he might or might not do? So there are lots of things that Australia can do, I think, to insulate ourselves against those worst instincts. And we know that, just putting your head down in the sand won't necessarily insulate you from the worst instincts of Trump. It doesn't matter how much you give him. Australia has literally been over there with $800 million, $900 million checks for the AUKUS submarine deal. And that hasn't been enough to stop the Trump administration effectively ripping up our free trade agreement, threatening us with tariffs, ignoring our interests altogether. And it's fairly clear from the evidence that pattern will continue. So there's a lot of work to be done, I think, and a lot of hard questions that will continue to come for Australia.
Yeah, Greg, one of the things Carney said was one of the best things we can do is build a strong national economy.
Rather than waiting for the old order to be restored, it means creating institutions and agreements that function as described. And it means reducing the leverage that enables coercion. That's building a strong domestic economy. It should be every government's immediate priority.
So how are we going on that front?
Quite interesting in the IMF report. It actually showed that Australia's economic growth is doing pretty well amongst the G7 nations. That's the biggest 7 economies in the world, which we're not part of. We're part of the G20. But for this year, we're expected to only be behind America in terms of growth, and America's growth is kind of a bit skewed because of what Trump did in the first part of the year. And next year, we're actually going to be expected to be doing better than all of them. So, we're doing okay. Part of the one good thing about our economy with regards to America is we don't export a lot to it. About 5% of our total exports go to America. We import a hell of a lot more from it. So, we're unlike Canada, which is literally attached to the hip geographically and economically to America, we are much less so. One of the more interesting things I found about Carney's speech on that was he was talking up Canada because, of course, remember, he's at Davos, so he's talking to all these, well-moneyed executives and whoever, trying to talk up how great Canada is. He talks about, it's got, it's an energy superpower. Well, so's Australia. Got lots of resources, so's Australia. And he talks about also their fiscal capability and capacity. And certainly you could say, well, does Australia have that? And I'd say not really, because if we taxed as much as Canada did, and Canada only just taxes around the average of the OECD, Australia'd be raising, or the Australian government would be raising about $130 billion more in tax every year. So Canada, who I don't think anyone looks at and thinks, oh, they're like the Scandinavian socialists, as Emma points out, Carney's a banker. But they raise $130 billion more. That'd be enough we could triple the age pension and we'd still have money to spend. So I took his speech and his lines about, building strong economies, and this also came out in some other report, a report by the OECD last week, looking specifically at Australia, pointing out that we probably should fix up a bit of our taxes and look at some of the, the things like the capital gains tax discount and the amount of tax breaks we give to superannuation and negative gearing and things like that, because we really need to raise a bit more money than we do if we want to have that strong foundation. So it was really interesting that, and he's right in that we can boast some things like Canada, but perhaps we need to boast a bit more tax. But also, I think his point about, all nations don't need to be reliant on America. Stop thinking that America is going to buy all your goods. The reality is they're not for many nations. And there are other, if America's not going to participate in trade blocks, well, then that's going to be their loss. And this is the thing we always come back to. Yeah, he threatens all these tariffs. So basically he's threatening to raise prices for Americans. That's the punishment. And certainly because tariffs don't really hurt Australia too much, we shouldn't fear getting involved with other trade blocks, whether they're involving China, Japan, Europe, and freeze out America until they're willing to act like adults again.
He also talked a lot about reducing personal and corporate taxes, but then about increasing defence spending. Emma, where does that leave us with AUKUS? I mean, does Canada have anything remotely like the multi-billion-dollar defence deal we have with the US government?
No, and I think that's what puts Australia in a slightly different position to Canada, in that, Canada has a close defence relationship with the United States, of course, and unsurprisingly, but it's not the same degree of enmeshment or the same nature of enmeshment that Australia has with the United States, that this government is clearly committed to pursuing and even doubling down on. So we are, I think, in a different position in that sense. But again, I think that's where Trump and Carney really offer us an opportunity. If Carney, who, as Greg was saying, literally borders the United States, they can't escape them, is having this or taking this opportunity to have a rethink of Canada's relationship with the United States, to, build up Canada's other alliances, its other free trade or its other trade agreements. Australia is perfectly capable of doing the same thing. We might need to do it in a slightly different way. And of course, we are geographically in a very different position. We have different neighbours. But again, we're entirely capable of working with those neighbours. I think it's also probably worth saying that this also isn't about just like passively accepting Carney's vision for the world either. I think that vision was lacking some substance and is not necessarily perfect. To go back to what you were saying earlier, Glenn, Carney talked in the speech about lowering the corporate tax rate. And I don't want to speak for Greg, but I think he and I would both argue that we don't want to engage in a race to the bottom in lowering corporate tax rates. That increases inequality. And, the United States is busy showing us that inequality creates insecurity. It creates instability. And I mean, when Carney was speaking as well about Canada as an energy superpower, he was very clearly leaving room there for fossil fuels. And, the same thing happens in Australia when the science could not be clearer that we need to stop extracting fossil fuels, both in Canada and in Australia. And I think just finally on that point as well, there's this kind of baked in assumption around what Carney was arguing, that all of this also requires, this kind of recalibration around Trump's America requires inevitably a huge increase in defense spending on the part of individual nations. And that's just not the case. It's not true that more defense spending inevitably makes us more secure. Australia already spends an obscene amount of money on defense compared to what we spend on other things that might make us safer. But of course, having said all of that, I think the lesson potentially out of Carney's speech is that Australia can and should be at the table, having these discussions about how to build something new and something better out of the destruction that Trump is wreaking.
Is the tide turning in terms of world leaders sucking up to Trump? I think of Sir Keir Starmer talking about Greenland and that ridiculous line from Trump about NATO troops in Afghanistan. Are world leaders changing their tune, and is that significant?
Look, I mean, I hope so. Certainly, I think you're right, Glenn, to single out Starmer, because that's been quite an interesting case study in how, being nice to Trump, kind of giving him all the coddling that he wants won't necessarily help you, because he'll turn around and attack you about something fairly unpredictable. And Starmer's response to those comments about NATO troops was striking.
And so I consider President Trump's remarks to be insulting and frankly appalling.
I think that's partly because the comments were so appalling and so offensive. Like, Trump was effectively insinuating that NATO troops were cowardly and were too afraid to be at the front lines, unlike strong American soldiers, which, of course, is the exact kind of thing Trump would say. But it really forced, I think, Starmer and other NATO allies to have a response. And it's the strongest so far that Starmer, I think, has been against Trump. So it will be interesting to see whether he continues down that path. But Starmer, I think, is in a not dissimilar position to Albanese in the nature of the UK's military and defence enmeshment with the United States, especially in terms of signals intelligence. So they're in that slightly different position to Canada. But I think it is striking that even Starmer, couldn't broach these comments. And that was partly pressure, I think, coming from underneath, coming particularly from the British tabloid press about how appalling these comments were, to so insult particularly servicemen and women who had lost their lives, I think crossed a boundary even for some people who've been unwilling to stand up to the president until now.
Emma, Greg, thank you both.
Pleasure. Thanks, guys.
No worries, Glenn. Pleasure.
And if you want to hear more from Emma and Greg, they both have their own weekly podcasts. Emma's show After America is released first thing early Tuesday morning, Australian Eastern Daylight Time. And Greg co-hosts Dollars and Cents, which returns for the year this Thursday afternoon. Find them both wherever you get your podcasts. Our latest book from Australia Institute Press, A Time for Bravery, What Happens When Australia Chooses Courage, is available now. Usually $35.99, you can save $5 by using the code POD5. You can order now from the australiainstitute.org.au/store or via the link in the show notes. This episode was recorded on Tuesday, the 27th of January, 2026. Our theme music is by Jonathan McFeet from Pulse and Thrum, with additional music from Blue Dot Sessions. I'm Glenn Connley. Thanks for listening.